First of all, you set on what topic it is that you want to inject some philosophy into. In this case, toys. Then start thinking about what are the concepts within that topic that you can play with. Well, toys naturally associate with play, and then it often helps to work in opposites. So play versus work, then perhaps girls' toys versus boys' toys, the business of whether toys are alive or not, so living, not living. Looking for a historical angle, so traditional versus modern toys, people's favourite toys, thinking about preferences there, imagination and imitation. Toys associated with growing up and outgrowing toys, and then that brings in the contrast between child and grown-up toys as well. The second layer is to start thinking about the questions which naturally emerge out of those concepts. So, for example, girls and boys' toys. Are some toys just for girls and some just for boys? Does it have to be like that? With play and work, taking things to an extreme is quite a good way. So the first one, we're sort of turning things upside down. Could you swap things over? With this one, taking things to an extreme, would it be good to play all the time or to play forever? Looking on to the next one, living versus not living. Maybe thinking about what kinds of things could count as a toy. A stone wouldn't seem to be a good thing as a toy. A pet seems to be an odd thing to have as a toy. So what are the things in between that can count as toys? Traditional and modern. Asking a question, are toys better now than 100 years ago? You could start to get some interesting evaluations of things going on there. With favourite toys, maybe you're bringing another concept there of love. Can you love a toy? Can you love a toy in the same way that you love a person? Imagination stroke imitation. Do toys help you pretend, or turn it into a why question? Why do we pretend? Or one other thing you can do is imagine taking something away. Can you pretend without toys? That can often help to identify how important something is if you imagine what the world would be like without it. So, for example, if you're doing something else, what would the world be like without mathematics? Or what would the world be like without science? Then moving round to growing up and outgrowing toys again, or children and grown-ups. Two ways of asking a question there. You could have, are toys just for children? Or you could have an assumption in there of, why do children need toys more than grown-ups? Is that true or isn't that true? Maybe someone will say, well, actually, I think adults need toys just as much. So we've got the starting theme, we've got our concepts, and we've got some questions around those concepts. Let's start now thinking about how we can translate those questions into activities. So what you're really doing here is you're almost doing some reverse engineering. You thought of the concepts you'd like to explore and the kinds of questions that you think might be interesting, and now you're creating activities or looking for stimuli that might lead to those questions. Of course, they might lead to other questions, and if you're going to do things democratically, so the questions come from the children, then maybe your personal favourite questions won't come up. But by having in mind the kinds of questions that something might lead to, you're more likely to settle on activities and stimuli that are going to lead to interesting discussions. So with the are some toys just for girls or boys, maybe we could have a go there at doing an upside down story where you turn things completely upside down, and we have maybe boys playing with girls' toys, girls playing with boys' toys. How would that change things? So it's a way of illuminating what's strange about what's everyday by turning it completely on its head. Then moving on from there, looking at that, what can count as a toy, perhaps we could have some sort of in or out game where you have to decide which particular things would count as a toy. In this case, you can take any concept or any idea, which sorts of things would definitely be part of it, which ones would definitely not be part of it, which ones would be on the border. And you can do this physically, making it into a game where the kids can see what each other think by having a sheet of sugar paper for each group, and then labels or pictures for each of the different items, and they have to either put those on the sugar paper or outside the sugar paper, depending on whether they think that this is an example of a whatever it may be or it isn't. Or you could do the same thing with a rope or string circle as well. So you might have some things that seem to be obviously part of it, like a doll or a game. Some things that seem very unlikely, like a stone or a room or the wind, and then some things in the middle, maybe a pet. A baby can't really be a toy, but then you can play with a baby. So what makes something a toy can't just be that you play with it. What about a thought, a word? Trying to find examples that aren't so easy to put in or out, so you're stretching the kids' thinking about the extent of a particular concept and what it is that makes something into a whatever it may be. Moving on to that question of, are toys better now than they were 100 years ago? So perhaps here you could have groups, and within each group they could have one old simple toy. It doesn't need to be an actual antique, but something like a hula hoop, for example. And they could then compare how many ways there are to play with that with how many ways there are to play with a more modern toy, perhaps some sort of branded action figure. I think Ken Robinson has used this or referred to this as a really good test of creativity, that when you give simple objects to young children, they can think of far more uses, possible uses for them, than is the case when you go to us old and crumblies or even teenagers. Then to growing up and outgrowing toys. Can you get too old for toys? You get them to bring in one toy that they play with still, and one which they used to like but they're too old for. And then you could do an interesting comparison between those. What are the features of the toys which we all say we're too old for now? What do the ones have in common that we say are just right for us now? So finding quite abstract connections between concrete things. Moving on to sort of, why do children need toys more than grown-ups, or are toys just for children? I think that would be a great opportunity for a bit of homeschool dialogue, so that you have some questions which the children take home to talk through with their parents on a sheet where the parent can record, or the child, depending on the age you're doing this with, what the child thinks and what the parent thinks, and that they might think differently about things. So you're starting to get that idea that reasonable people, children and grown-ups, can have different opinions, and that it's still interesting and worthwhile hearing the opinions of the children. And it'll also start to get parents a bit curious. Couple of little thoughts about other things. Perhaps with the living, not living, are toys alive or not? You could maybe use a clip from Toy Story and explore that business of pretending that toys are alive while knowing that they're not really. And you could use that as a way into looking at the difference between what's living and what's not living. Maybe that could be something which could link into biology there. Feel another story coming on in connection with the questions about pretending. A story about perhaps a boy who couldn't pretend. Again, that business of taking something out of the world in order to expose how important it is. In this case, the capacity that children have to pretend. Some other stimuli, one connected with the question of would it be good to play all the time or forever. I'm thinking of a picture book called How to Live Forever, which features a character called the Eternal Child. I know people have used that with year 3 and upward. You'll know your own groups much better than I can imagine them. So we've gone from having our theme, to having our concepts, to having our questions, to some stimuli and some starting points and some activities that might create those questions. So questions like those might come from the children through these different activities. Let's have a think now about what kind of thinking is actually going to be involved in those different activities and in answering those different questions. And that might then highlight, oh well, we want to do a bit more thinking of this particular kind, so what else can we do? Helps us to keep track of what we're trying to achieve and to fill in and notice any gaps over the course of a term or a year of particular skills within P4C that we're not addressing. So with the upside down story of boys with girls' toys and vice versa, I think that's a good thing for imagining alternatives, sort of thinking what if, is this possible? Does it have to be that way? The story of the boy who couldn't pretend, I think that could yield some interesting stuff about empathetic thinking, putting yourself in the shoes of another person. The in or out game, that's going to be practicing the skills of defining and categorizing, drawing the limits of a particular concept. And also, like all these things, there's going to be some giving of reasons there, giving of reasons why you think something would or would not count as a toy. The exercise comparing the potential of simple traditional toys and more modern specific ones, that's going to be good for creative thinking, thinking about possibilities, brainstorming, creating an atmosphere where children are coming up with ideas, and those ideas in a sense can't be wrong, so they'll be less inhibited about coming out with them. Notice that all these questions and challenges are contestable. Different people can have different ideas, and it's very difficult to say that's absolutely the right one. I'll never say there's no right or wrong answer, because I think that's prejudging things. But as far as the children are concerned, what's important is that whatever ideas they come up with can be accepted and celebrated as part of what everybody's doing. They haven't got to put their finger on your answer in order for it to be a valid response to the question. With the question, can you love a toy, and then comparing that with other types of love, like for friends or family or pets, you're getting into quite subtle territory potentially of drawing distinctions between different types of love and clarifying what you mean by love. Do we always mean the same by it, or does it have different meanings? So lots of opportunities there for some really nitty-gritty thinking. The homeschool dialogue with parents about favourite toys and so on, that will give lots of opportunities for giving reasons, and it's also extending that community of inquiry into the home. When they bring in different toys that are ones that they like now, ones they used to like, then that's looking for examples. That's actually finding physical examples of something, so that they can then move on to finding examples within arguments. And also looking at similarities between different types of toys, so comparison. Now that we've done all this work, going from theme to concept to questions to stimuli and starting points and activities, and then on to the actual kinds of thinking moves that are going to be involved there, it's possible to perhaps frame a big question that could be the bookending question for this whole unit of work. What I mean by that is a question which you ask at the beginning and get initial reactions about, and you ask again at the end, and you get perhaps a slightly more sophisticated understanding of the question, and the different reasons that people have brought to bear on the other questions and activities can come out again to enrich a final answer. And what strikes me as the question that perhaps all this could feed into is what makes a good toy, because that would connect to all these different concepts that we had. It's a contestable question, and it's a jolly interesting one. I'd be interested to find out what people's answers are, both adults and children. And a final little thing, looking around those different questions and the different skills that have been practiced there, the one skill that hasn't come out a great deal is actually getting them to create questions. That'll happen hopefully all the way along in different ways, but it strikes me as a great opportunity to introduce a particular question creating exercise where you perhaps ask a bear or some sort of toy, and you get people to come up with as many different questions as possible that they could ask that bear, and then you could sort them into different kinds of questions in terms of how could you answer them. Which ones could you ask an expert about? Which ones would you have to use your imagination about? Which ones would you need to discuss together? What I've been hoping to demonstrate in this exercise is that P4C is a conceptual education, and it's a way you can look at any topic that you've got, find the philosophical depth in it, find questions that are going to stimulate interesting discussions, but which can also feed back into other curriculum areas. You can do bits of history, you can do bits of science that connect with this, but all those things are feeding back into a central inquiry question which is in the background in everything that you're doing, so that the topic is question driven rather than content driven. I hope you found this useful, and if you'd like more stuff like this and also very different to this, go to www.philosophyman.com to sign up for a free bulletin of resources that comes out most weeks by email from me, Jason Buckley. Thank you.